Um, so let's start there. Oh, and there's little people. I like it. All right. So good morning, guys. Here's what we're gonna do. Just going to basically. I have a plan in mind, but I wanted to at least throw it out there. Do any of you have any specific contract questions or a form that you would maybe like to start to go over with? And you can chat. You can unmute. It's a small group. I'm not really worried about it. I just thought if you had something in mind or something that came up, we could start there. Otherwise, I'm going to start at the very beginning because it's a very good place to start.
I'm good with starting at the beginning.
Okay. Ginger Maynard is joining. I don't think that's true. Oh, maybe that's Darcy. Might have to update that. I was like, Ginger's joining from retirement. Oh, I like it. Okay, well, if nobody has anything kind of overly pressing, I'm going to start, like I said, at the very beginning. And part of this is going to be just an opportunity for you guys to kind of bounce ideas around each other, hearing what other people do, how other people manage things, and we're just going to see what happens. So with that, I got to get my green button. Here we go. All right, so first things first. I'm going to move your beautiful faces so I can see you all on one screen. Amy, you have like a picturesque background going on there. Like you're so well lit and you have the sun in the background. It's very irritating.
Sorry.
All right, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I always have to count. Anybody else have to count their zeros when they log in?
Oh, yeah.
I always have to stop halfway through it. All right, so I'm going to open transaction desk. I'm going to try to keep this to 30 minutes today. And then, like I said, this is going to just kind of be a standing opportunity that we're going to sort of work on here. So I'm going to go into my transactions, and then I have one of my demo accounts here. All right, so the first one that I figured we're going to start with is agency. It's the first form. If nobody has anything else that's kind of pressing, I wanted to cover this one. And ultimately, you guys, it is a required form, right? It is a statutory required form. And so, right, Minnesota law requires that early in any relationship, real estate brokers or salespersons, that's you guys and me, must disclose with consumers what type of agency representation or relationship they desire. Okay. Now, first question that often gets brought up is this phrase right here. Early on. How do you guys define early? Is it first time you meet somebody? Is it
the money? When you talk about money.
Okay, when you talk about money, that's all right. Yep. Anybody else got a different definition? When do you define early on? Because here's what happens. You and I get pulled into a Department of Commerce investigation. They're going to pull this form, and then they're going to say, great, what's the date on the form?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Ken gave me money. Here's the generic term that I teach: price, terms, or motivation. Okay, because those three things is what allows us to essentially, it can be used against a client, right? Price, terms, or motivation, right? So the moment, to Ken's point, they talk about price, right? They talk about money, how much money they're looking to spend, how much money they're looking down. Maybe they're a cash buyer and they say, I don't know, I got $250,000 cash from an inheritance. I want to buy a house because normally I can't afford one. Super cool. We would love to help you, right? We like cash buyers. So that's price. Terms. The moment they tell you, well, I'm an FHA buyer and I have a down payment assistance loan to cover the first 3.5%. Oh, and I need help with closing costs. Totally fine, right? The reason terms matter is because if you are the listing agent on something and this guy or gal walks through your open house, but they're slowly but surely represented by, ABC Realty down the road, ABC Realty all of a sudden sends you an offer with, this particular buyer's name. Well, you now know the terms and you know that they need, down payment assistance, and you know that they have seller paid concessions. So from that perspective, that's a lot of ammunition that you can use in a negotiation. And then motivation, right? Motivation is another factor that you can turn around and essentially use on somebody to negatively impact their terms. So that's why we use price, terms, and motivation, kind of the standard default as when this form comes out, okay? So early on, right, to me, is when that consumer gives you anything related to price terms and motivation. Now you have to show them, what type of agency do you desire? I always thought that was an interesting word, right? Like they have the option or the desire, which is true. So the available options are listed below. This is always important, okay? This is not a contract. People panic the moment you try to bring an agency relationship form out. They're like, well, wait a minute, I'm not ready to sign anything. I just met you. I just walked through the door. I totally understand. This is not a contract. Okay, this is an agency disclosure form only. If you desire representation, you must enter into a written contract according to state law. Now, it's important for you guys to know you don't have an option to, you can't write without actually having a contract to represent somebody, which is why we talk about buyer representation so much, right? You cannot, according to state law, Chapter 82 specifically states it, plus contract law, Statute 562, I want to say, specifically talks about terms of a written contract, okay? So in order for you to do anything for representation, they must enter into a written contract, buyer or lister, okay? A listing contract or a buyer tenant representation contract as it states. Until such a time as you choose to enter into a written contract for representation, you will be treated, this is important, as a customer and will not receive any representation from the broker or the salesperson. That's you, that's me, whoever's in that contract or building rapport with that particular individual. The broker or salesperson will be acting as a facilitator. So this is important, you guys, because this is the default role in the great state of Minnesota, okay? If you forgot or you don't remember, right, the facilitation role is our default role that we are required to provide to a customer or a consumer until they choose to enter into a written contract or buy into our services and our value proposition for that individual. Now, so this will be the default role unless the broker or salesperson is representing another party as described below, such as you could be a listing agent is going to be the most common one, right? You're sitting in an open house. Even if it's not your listing, right? Like, let's say Danny sits in Mr. Roloff, in one of Roloff's listings down in Morris. She's just doing an open house on Saturday, right? Guy walks in, hey, I'm interested in buying. Totally cool. Danny is now actually representing the seller in that situation because, again, we're all under the family of Coldwell Banker Crown Realtors. All the listings belong to Coldwell Banker Crown Realtors. Therefore, you represent all the listings of Coldwell Banker Crown Realtors. So that's where you just got to be careful. Now, if you're in a situation, you're at a soccer game, because I'm a little partial, right? You're hanging out with soccer, somebody walks up because you're wearing a Coldwell Banker t-shirt. Great opportunity to brand yourself and make yourself aware, by the way. You're wearing one of your Coldwell Banker t-shirts. Somebody walks up and says, oh, hey, how's the market? Right? Because you never hear that question. You need to understand that in that situation, you act as a facilitator. Oh, hey, yeah, that's cool. Great. The market's going well. Tell me about that house on 123 Main Street you guys have listed. I saw that one. It looks great. Super cool, right? We have it listed. Now you're acting in a facilitator role, which we'll get to later as far as the fiduciary obligations. So it's this section here, 9 through 11. The acknowledgement, we acknowledge that we have been presented with the below described options and understand that we have signed that until, again, there's that word, until we sign a representation contract, we are not being represented by the broker salesperson. I understand that written consent is required for a dual agency relationship, which we will define below. And then there's always this part here, which I usually highlight pretty aggressively, or probably the first thing and the last thing I talk about. This is a disclosure only, not a contract for representation, right? So when people get really bucky and they say, oh, I'm not interested in signing anything today. I just thought we were here talking. We are here totally just talking. However, Minnesota law, and I always say, in case you're a spy for the Department of Commerce who regulates my license, I need to make sure that you know that I know I have to do this according to state law. Right? Like I try to make a joke out of it because it's a disclosure only. You're simply signing the form stating you've seen it and you understand it. That's it. I still only represent you as a facilitator, and then I go back through lines 2 through 8. So usually I'll start here, then I'll start to work my way down the different sections, right? Because people get really bucky, again, once they see something that they have to sign. And electronically is a little bit harder, which is why I sort of always talk about you want to make sure you have a video, right? If you can record yourself talking about agency, put it on your YouTube channel, which comes with your Coldwell Banker G Suite workspace account. Record a video of you from your phone talking about agency. And then you just send that out to everybody, right? Hey, we're going to meet today at this open, at this listing. I just want you to watch this video. I'm going to have a form for you to sign, but I explain the entire form in this video, right? You can save yourself 5-6 minutes explaining this form. Some people tell me they do it faster. That's totally fine. I usually take I think I got it down to 4 or 5 minutes to explain this form in a meaningful way that I feel like I can actually stand behind if I was ever to go on trial. So, any questions on lines 2 through 13? It's a lot. I feel like I'm just spewing information. I don't know if it's meaningful or not. I haven't seen Amy smile yet.
Good reminders, Brandon.
All right. Well, thanks, Ken. Okay. So again, this is the top side. These are the areas that you really need to cover when you start to work through the disclosure, right? So now the date on here, nobody asked the question, well, what happens if nobody wants to sign it, right? So a trick that I picked up, I don't even remember how long ago, but a trick that I picked up is that if nobody wants to sign it, guess what you can still have them do? You can have a section, you can just write on here, declined. This is going to be really hard to do this. Decline to sign, right? And then have them initial it. Because guess what they just did?
They signed it.
Exactly, right? They still signed the form that says, hey, I got in here, I explained it, but they declined to sign, but I got them to initial and date it, right? And that's the important thing of making sure you kind of cover your tush on this thing. Now, the one thing I will tell you is that we're really bad at this, and so is everybody in the industry, but guess what date is often on the agency relationships form, your buyer representation form, and your purchase agreement? Danny is smiling because guess what? It's the same one, right?
Yeah.
Now you want to be really careful about this though, and this is where we got to kind of up our game a little bit again, because if we were ever to get pulled into an ethics violation, ever pulled into a Department of Commerce, trial or something like that, if somebody filed a claim against us, anything like that, all of these forms are your backbone to making sure that you did your job well. As I sit on the ethics complaints, at the state level, the amount of forms that we look at and we say, oh, hey, by the way, isn't this kind of interesting that you have your agency, your representation, and your purchase agreement all dated the same day? How long did you spend with that client on that day? Oh, I don't know. It was all authenticized, so I assumed that they sent it. Great. Can you send us the certification of the timestamp of everything? Because you can get that out of Transaction Desk. Sure enough, they sent it, and guess what? The time that they sent it to the time the client signed is usually less than an hour. Most consumers are going to have questions about a lot of this stuff, right? So if you get these in the time frame that you should, right? I'm not saying your agency relationship and your buyer rep or your listing contract, all those can be dated the same day, right? Like that's a reasonable thing. We do buyer consultations, we do listing presentations, we go through this form and we go through the contract. That's pretty reasonable, right? But to have on the buy side, to have the purchase agreement the same date is pretty unrealistic. Now, I'm not going to tell you there are not situations, and if you do this long enough, you will get them where you meet somebody, they say, this is the only house I want to look at. I want to write an offer and I'm not represented.
Thank you.
That can happen in the same day, right? So it can happen, but try your best to get this out there. My usual philosophy, sellers, is I usually send it before the listing consultation, right? So I send it to them and say, you're going to sign this when we meet. Minnesota state law says you have to. Also, a fun factoid is that if you look at this form, Minnesota state law is highlighted right here. So that's kind of a win. It's you can blame somebody else if you don't want to sign the form because they have to. And then on the buy side, I do it on the buyer consultation. I pull it out at the front side of my 45-minute consultation. I say, hey, just so you know, I'm going to have you sign this form. I'm going to talk about it later. I just want to prep you for it. And then I go into the rest of the spiel. Okay. Because you never want to leave with that. And if people are like, well, can I get a copy? Yeah, you can have a copy all day long, right? Take a scan with your phone, send it through Transaction Desk so they have a copy that you can start. Plus, it's a really good way to train somebody on electronic signatures if they're not comfortable with it. This is a really easy form to train people on because it's 2 pages, 1 signature block, and it's a nice way to train them on that. So again, if you can't get the signatures, simply you can do this decline to sign, right? You can write it anywhere. I had one agent I was talking to a while ago. They actually put it when they had somebody who doesn't want to sign, they write it up here. So it looks like they're not even near the signature line. But as long as this is just a spot, that's all, right? So if you put decline to sign up here and they initial and you still date it, right? 13 today. According to the Department of Commerce, they saw it, they signed the form, right? So you can prove that they saw the form even though they didn't sign the form. Kind of a fun little workaround. All right. Any questions on any of that came up? Otherwise, I'm going to move into the first section here.
On the envelopes and mailed them.
Seeing none. Okay. Let's go ahead. I'm going to clear my drawings here. All right. So let me scroll here. All right. So let's talk about the first section. So if you're unfamiliar, right, you're going to get 4 sections of this form. The first one is going to be a seller broker form, buyer broker, dual agency, and then the last one's the facilitator side. Okay. So let's see how we do here. So on the seller broker form, a broker who lists a property. So this is just defining your relationship, right? A broker who lists a property or a salesperson who is licensed, to the listing broker represents the seller/landlord and acts on behalf of the seller/landlord. Now, a lot of us, I don't see a lot of us really working on behalf of landlords, right? Every once in a while, you're going to get somebody who says, hey, can you help me find a tenant? Can you help me find a residential tenant or even a commercial tenant, right? In that situation, the thing you know is that I should start. This form is good for what properties?
Like this one did. Sure, this one did.
Residential
Residential, how many units?
or less.
Or less. Well done, right? So if you have a 12-plex that comes up, right, and they want to sell it, super cool. You don't need to sign this form. Anything zoned commercial doesn't need to sign this form. This is a residential only. It's a consumer protection form, is the only thing that you actually have to work through. Okay, so on the landlord side, right, if you're being represented to find a tenant, then that's when you start to have that conversation. Otherwise, it's strictly for residential transactions, 1 to 4 units. If you got a duplex you're listing, the form has got to get signed because for whatever reason, the Minnesota Department of Commerce says that if you own 5 or more units in one building, you obviously know what you're doing. That's essentially the basis of the argument. So it is what it is, right? But so a broker who lists property or a salesperson who is licensed to the listing broker represents the seller and acts on behalf of the seller. Okay, that's what we're doing. A seller broker owes the seller the fiduciary duties described on page 2. Owes the fiduciary duties. So it owes all of them. We'll talk about those later. And the broker must also disclose to the buyer material facts as decided in Statute 8268, subsection 3, of which the broker is aware that can adversely affect the buyer's use or enjoyment of the property. So that's when we talk about your material fact, right? You, as a licensee in the great state of Minnesota, do not have the opportunity to not disclose something you believe could be a material fact. And if you wonder what could be a material fact, well, it's anything that could adversely or significantly affect a buyer's use and enjoyment of the property. So water in the basement, that's a pretty big one. A tree that's coming down. You start talking about Dutch elm disease that's on the property. Grub worms, you name it. Anything that you can possibly think of. And the longer you do this, the more of the same homes you start to walk through, right? And you start to remember like, oh man, I was in this thing like 6 years ago. And remember that entire basement flooded and was redone, which is why that deal fell apart the first time, right? Weird things like that will come back to your memory as I'm learning the longer I do this. So you need to understand that if you know of anything, you have a statutory, you are legally required to disclose those things. And the one form that still does not exist as much as we ask is an agent disclosure form coming from the Minnesota Association of Realtors. They don't have one. But if you know of something, you need to put it on. You just create a simple Word document. Here, here's the address, here's the date, here's what I know to be true about the property, and you sign it, and then you send that off to buyers and sellers, right? Like you have to do that as part of your statutory requirements. So the broker must also disclose to buyers any material facts. So if a seller tells you something and they're like, well, I don't really want to talk about that, and you should cut bait and run because that person is shady and should not be associated with you. But that's all part of your obligation, is to determine what could adversely and significantly affect the buyer's use and enjoyment of the property. Chapter 82 does not apply to rental and lease transactions. Okay, so your material fact disclosure does not apply if you were helping somebody place a tenant in one of their units. Okay, that's kind of weird, but that's the way it is. If a broker or salesperson working with a buyer has as a customer is representing the seller, he or she must act in the seller's best interest and tell the seller any information disclosed to him, except confidential information acquired in a facilitation relationship. So this is where you guys get a little bit of an opportunity that during that open house, right, you learn about something that could be used in a method, right, to essentially say, hey, we're going to walk through this thing and have a conversation about, they said they're really eager, their timeline, they're desperate, they're cash buyers, like we could take them, for full list, maybe a little over if we, heighten the close date, something like that. And that's where you have an obligation, because you got to remember at this point in this relationship, you represent the seller, not the consumer or the customer. So at that point, you get to have a conversation, right? Working through, and that information has to be disclosed, except confidential information acquired during a facilitation relationship, which we will talk about later on. In that case, the buyer, right? So in this case, if this happens, the buyer will not be represented and will not receive advice and counsel from the broker or salesperson. Now, one of the big things a lot of times we talk about is, so if fiduciary obligation is required, okay, in all of these roles, these are the two words that really stick out as to why you should get a representation contract. Okay, if somebody says, well, if I sign this and you're required to give all this stuff to me, why should I work with you over Joe Blow at ABC Realty? Well, here's why, right? Yes, every agent out there every licensee should be giving you all the fiduciary obligations. However, the two words that I use, right? So the Minnesota statute or this form says advice and counsel, right? I use advocate and advise. I say it doesn't matter what everybody's required to do. Everybody's going to do it differently. Hopefully they all do their job, but we know not everybody does their job. But what really changes is why you hire us and why you hire me is because of how I'm going to advise and counsel you in that process, right? Advocate and advise. So how am I going to advise you? How am I going to take care of you? And how am I going to advocate for you? How am I going to fight for you in that process? And as you start to, and this is just me, right? You guys will find your own way to spin this. But then as you start to learn more about different situations that come up and that you are fighting for your client, right? Like I know Danny was working on one where they had a massive appraisal issue, right? Lucas, I know, has worked through a couple of challenging ones this year so far. So when you have those success stories, like you want to make sure you have those things to recall what you need is so you know when you have it. Because you don't ever want to get into a situation when somebody says, oh, well, how do you advise and advocate for people? Well, let me tell you a story, right? Stories sell significantly better than some bullet pointed list. And if you have the story that you can actually personally share, that's awesome. And if you don't have your own personal stories yet, listen to other people as they're sharing about these stories. Like when we do our roundtable discussions on our meetings and stuff, listen to the stories that are coming up, because that's the kind of stories you can steal and say, well, you know what, at our brokerage, we do this, right? Our team does this. And you can use my stories, you can use Mitch's, Lucas's, Denise, whoever. You can use anybody's story when it's part of the team because you're part of the team, right? And so it's it's a shift in dynamics and how you look to take care of some of that stuff. So this is the seller-broker relationship, right? It basically says somebody who's representing the seller. That's the bottom line. Any questions on that section there? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to see if we can breeze through the buyer stuff before I let you go, because I'm trying to keep it to 30 minutes so that we can all keep moving on with our days, okay? All right, buyer broker tenancy. So this is a buyer may enter into an agreement for the broker or salesperson to represent and act on behalf of the buyer tenant. Notice it's the same first line, just with different words, right? So the broker may represent a buyer only and not the seller, even if he or she is being paid in whole, or my personal favorite, which if you've been around long enough, you know that I think you're worth more than the 2.5% that's given out in MLS, right? Or in part by the seller. A buyer's broker owes the buyer the fiduciary duties described on page 2. the buyer, or excuse me, the broker must disclose any material facts. So you'll notice there's that section. Here, if a broker is or salesperson working with a seller as a customer is representing the buyer, he or she must act in the buyer's best interest and must tell them any information disclosed to them except confidential information acquired during a facilitation relationship. Are you sensing a theme and how these are laid out?
Yep.
Right? Okay, so there's essentially a few things, right? First thing we do is we talk about what I'm going to say here. And you'll notice this is pretty streamlined, right? That's why this form is pretty vanilla, right? Section 1 is specific to the area. Section 2, let's see here. Section 2 talks about your material fact disclosures, right? And then 3 talks about what happens if you run into somebody when you're representing somebody and the other person is not. Where do your fiduciary obligations lie, right? So on a buyer side, you got to remember, and this is something I just got, talk about irritants. I just got bypassed on a deal the other day from a good friend, a good acquaintance, I'll say, and a past client, and somebody who's called me for real estate advice. And I found out they were looking at houses, and I reached out. I said, "Hey, I heard that you saw on one of your stories or your social medias that you've been looking at houses. Any reason I didn't get a call? I thought I was providing great service to you and great value." Her response was, "Well, it wasn't listed by you. I didn't know you could show it to me." Oh, talk about a gut check. Like, oh shoot, we need to remind people, right? And this is just a good encouragement for you. Like, we need to remind people all the time, like, it doesn't matter whose side is in the yard. We can help you buy and sell real estate in the great state of Minnesota, anywhere in the great state of Minnesota. And so it was a good reminder and something for you to kind of throw in the back of your mind too, like, oh, okay. Like if you're ever looking for content, right, to newsletters or email blasts or social media, videos, whatever you're doing to stay top of mind with people, that's an easy one. Just a quick reminder, like, hey, did you know that no matter what color the yard sign is, I still have the ability to kind of come in and help you out. So that's a real easy way to kind of look at some of that. But anyway, so that's the seller and broker section, right? And so you can see, I'm going to just kind of highlight this here. So you can see that these guys are all broken down into, whoopsie, similar situations here, right? 1, 2, and 3. And you'll see this same kind of a theme as we go through dual agency and the facilitation next week. So before I let you guys go, because it's 9:30 and I want to respect your time, number 1, is this helpful?
Yes.
Okay. Number 2, is this much detail meaningful to go? I mean, I hate to say it kind of line by line, right? But we haven't done this in a long time, so I thought maybe it would be a good start. And then 3, is a half hour in this time window acceptable? Just trying to keep it short and sweet so we still get on with our day.
I say yes to all 3.
Okay,
Yep.
Fantastic. All right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna keep it right next Monday, 9 o'clock. We're gonna pick up with dual agency, and we're gonna keep going down the road as we go. So, anyway, you guys, 9:31. I'm a minute over. I hope you have an amazing day. If you got any questions, I'm around. Feel free to call or text, and we'll take care of you, and we'll go from there. So, blessings to you guys. We will see you hopefully tomorrow for a meeting. We'll see you.
Thanks, Brad.
Bye.